Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. While homelessness is a problem nationwide, it may be becoming a crisis in California. It's been reported that over 161,000 people experience homelessness in California, living in tents, cars, or on the streets. Who are the homeless? Our guest is Monica Davalos. She is with the California Budget and Policy Center. She has some answers on some of the questions we might have. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So listen, let's, you recently put out a fact sheet. I want to kind of go over that. Who is experiencing homelessness in California? One of the facts you have is that homelessness is temporary for a lot of people, but there are some people that face long-term chronic homelessness. Can you describe what's going on?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And thanks for bringing it up. I wanted to start off with a reminder, though, that really having a place to call home is really the most basic foundation for health and well-being. As you know, not having it really impacts every aspect of your life. But to your question, when we're talking about people who are experiencing homelessness, they tend to be categorized in 2 main ways. One is those who are experiencing chronic homelessness and those who are considered as temporarily homeless. And so during the last pre-pandemic point in time count, we found that roughly 30% of unhoused Californians were considered chronically. And so what this means is that these individuals have a long-standing disability that really impedes their ability to live independently and have been unhoused for at least a year or for multiple periods within a three-year period. And so, however, the majority, so roughly 70% of Californians who are homeless are considered as experiencing short-term homelessness. And so oftentimes, like, these folks just fall into homelessness because simply they can't afford a place to live.
Yeah. Your report also says that, unhoused Californians are primarily single-aged adults, smaller share of with families with children and unaccompanied youth. What are the numbers in that regard?
Yeah, so adults not with children make up roughly 77% of the unhoused population. So again, a large majority. And these are folks who are age 25 and older. And it's composed of either sole individuals, couples, groups of adults, or non-custodial parents. And that's why we say adults not with children. And they're particularly vulnerable to housing insecurity, oftentimes because adults without children don't qualify for a lot of our social safety net programs. Most of those are designed for families, especially the ones that may provide some cash assistance. And the ones that they are eligible for are often, quite frankly, inadequate and have a lot of barriers to them. And the other major group that...
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to go to families. So families actually make up the roughly 14%. And this is followed by like unaccompanied youth and parenting youth, which make up the remaining 9%.
What about racial disparities?
Yeah, so unfortunately, racial disparities are not new, and they're very, very rampant and very visible within California's homeless population. Black, non-Latinx Californians have the most significant disparity, as they only make up roughly 5.5% of the state's population, but make up nearly every 1 in 4 individuals who made contact with the homeless service response system.
You noted in your report that most of the homelessness is really in LA County, over 50%, and you're saying that kind of resources should be allocated according to where the homelessness is. Does that mean, I think the Valley has, San Joaquin Valley has about 7.4% of the homeless in California. Do you think then the Valley should get 7.4% of the housing allocation and the allocation for the homeless?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So to clarify though, so the LA County specifically has roughly 40%. It's LA County and the South Coast region that have roughly a little over half of California's homeless population. But when we're designing our systems and how we fund our solutions, they really should be proportionate to where the problems are. So in this case, right, it does mean giving money to to areas that have the highest needs. But it's not to say that it's only for those regions. Homelessness exists across every county and every region across California.
Yeah, we've got about a minute left, but I did want to ask you this. One of the things you talked about was the aging population, that the unhoused population is aging, comprised of a lot more older adults. What are the numbers and why is that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we did find that roughly 45% of unhoused Californians in adult-only households are over the age of 50. And these are folks that came in contact with the homelessness response system. And fundamentally, this just goes to support the current research that shows that the homeless population is aging. And this is very alarming, right? Because older adults are falling into homelessness, or obviously these adults are falling into homelessness at an older age. Again, because of our weak social safety net programs specifically for adults. And we know that older adults also tend to have more underlying health conditions that are really
right.
exacerbated.
So you're one financial emergency or medical emergency away from homelessness if you're older. That's the point. Well, I want to thank Monica Davalos with the California Budget and Policy Center for joining us. When we come back, a look at what the state's been doing to address the homelessness situation. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. According to the non-partisan Legislative Analyst's Office, California has more homelessness than any other state in the nation. Indeed, while California represents 12% of the U.S. population, it has 28% of the nation's homelessness. There are another 6%, about 2.5 million Californians, who are teetering right on the edge of homelessness, loss of a job or medical emergency. So it's a big issue. Indeed, it's a statewide issue and it requires a statewide response. Our next guest is Lourdes Morales. She is housing specialist with the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office, and she's here to explain some of the state's recent efforts in this regard. So welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that there's been a change now in the relationship between state and local governments when it comes to homelessness. Can you explain?
Absolutely. Historically, local governments have provided most of the homelessness assistance in their community, in part relying on state and federal funding. However, as the homelessness crisis has become more acute, the state has upped its role in providing direct financial assistance to local governments. This funding has largely been flexible, so these communities can make decisions about how to best help people experiencing homelessness as they see fit. However, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the state has also invested significant funding in infrastructure to give people a safe place to shelter during this public health emergency. So overall, we see significant, although largely one-time funding being provided for homelessness from the state to local governments.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing too that, in your report, you say that it's not just the 2.5 million that are teetering, there are another 1.5 million that are severely cost impacted by housing too. So this is a huge problem. So there have been a lot of things that have been happening, at the state level to kind of address this problem. Can you give us an example of some of the things that they've been doing?
Sure. We see over $9.4 billion in funding across various programs that serve to address the needs of people experiencing homelessness across the state. I already mentioned the flexible aid to local governments and the infrastructure to secure hotels and motels, but there's also other programs. For example, behavioral health services for people experiencing homelessness, as well as funding for local governments to clear encampments, as well as to provide supports for people living in encampments to give them a safe place to shelter. So these are just a few of the key programs, but we also see funding in other departments that have a looser connection. So, for example, funding for vets through our Cal Vets department.
Yeah, and I think the programs that people probably are aware of is that Project Room Key and Home Key programs. I mean, Room Key, my understanding is that they're renting hotel rooms for the homeless, and how Home Key, they're actually buying the hotels and making it more of a permanent solution. So there's a lot going on there. The governor also has some things in his most recent budget for the 22-23 cycle. What are some of the homelessness proposals he's making in the new budget?
Yes, the governor's proposing $2 billion in one-time general fund over 2 years to address really the near-term solutions of people experiencing homelessness, to give time for other funding that has been authorized to sort of come online that do provide those long-term solutions. As you mentioned, sort of Home Key is supposed to provide permanent shelter. And so sort of while we give time for that to come online, the governor sort of provides more funding for tiny home building, for example.
Yeah, those ADUs, right? Accessible dwelling units, or granny flats, as people call them.
That's right. As well as more funding to sort of support encampments, so sort of both sort of provide cleanup efforts, but also support individuals living in those encampments. So there's significant increase in funding on that front as well.
And people see those encampments. I'm sure that's a political hot issue, frankly, that the governor and politicians want to address, because that's what people see, and then frankly they complain about. Let me ask you this: you guys take a look at this stuff, and you've got some recommendations going forward. What are some of the recommendations from your office?
Yeah, first off, we'd say that the state has made notable progress since its engagement began to increase in the 2018-19 budget, not only by providing sort of more fiscal support directly to local governments and other entities, but then also by improving its collaboration with local governments and the information it's collecting. So we have a better sense of what the needs are, and that sort of visibility will increase over time, so that they can sort of continue to make better decisions about how to spend its money on this front.
Okay.
Sort of, but despite this,
go ahead.
But sort of despite this progress, we know that the scale of the homeless crisis is immense, and sort of significant continued work is necessary, and the state will likely need to maintain a fiscal engagement moving forward. And so we suggest the legislature dedicate this early part of the budget process to really overseeing those prior efforts, to really assess sort of what is working well and sort of where are there improvements before significant expansion of programs continues.
Yeah, that feedback loop, a lot of times people forget about that. What they're not going to focus on is, I want a new program, but you're saying, hey, wait a second, take a look at what you've already done and see if it's working. Makes a lot of sense. Very, very logical and rational. And that's what we expect from the Legislative Analyst Office. I want to thank our guest, Lourdes Morales, with the non-partisan Legislative Analyst Office, for joining us. When we come back, the state has spent billions of dollars addressing homelessness for the last few years. Has it made any impact? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. As noted by the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, the majority of California's homeless population are unsheltered. Indeed, 70% of the 161,000 plus people who are experiencing homelessness are living in tents, cars, and on the streets. The situation was substantially made worse, obviously, by the pandemic. The state has responded by spending billions of dollars to address homelessness the last few years. The question is, has it had any impact? Our guest is Marisol Cuellar Mejia, who is a research fellow with the PPIC. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Good morning, Mark, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of today's program.
So listen, I want to ask you, there have been a lot of attempts to measure the impact of the state's efforts on addressing homelessness. There's something called the Annual Homelessness Assessment. When was it done, and what does it focus on?
Yes. So the Annual Homeless Assessment Report is a report to the U.S. Congress prepared by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This report provides national, state, and local level estimates of the number of people experiencing homelessness. And these estimates come from point-in-time count conducted on a single night in January. Also, the report provides data about the inventory of shelter and housing beds available in the community to serve the homeless population. But one thing that was interesting about last year's report was that because of the pandemic, communities were not required to count on shelter homeless people. So the report offers a more limited assessment than usual, focusing only on people in emergency shelters, transitional housing, and safe havens. And also one thing, it is important to highlight that, as you mentioned, the vast majority of the homeless population in California is unsheltered. So that means that this report offers just a view of a share of the entire homeless population in our state.
And this is a one night snapshot. So, but I want to ask you, what did the report show when it comes to California?
So when it comes to California, for that specific population in shelters, the report shows that there were about 51,000 people experiencing shelter homelessness in California in 2021, which marks a 7% increase from the count in 2020. And also stands in contrast to what happened at the national level, where shelter homeless declined by 8%. In fact, California was one of the 14 states that reported increases. And let me tell you, of the 51,000 homeless people in shelters, those people represent 16% of all people in shelters in the country. And also, I think it's important to highlight that the report also includes information on the chronically homeless population, which the Department of Housing and Urban Development defines as individuals with a disability who have been continuously homeless for 1 year or more. And the report shows that number of individuals, which represents about 36% of all individuals in shelters in our state, increased by 49%, which is very significant between 2020 and 2021. And this really could mean that shelters are doing a much better job targeting.
I was going to ask you that. I mean, why that number go up? So you're thinking, you're saying that when I read your report, without an estimate of the unsheltered population in 2021, we cannot determine whether the increase in sheltered homelessness was driven by unsheltered people moving into shelters or by an increase in the number of homeless people. And you think it's the latter. Why?
So what I think, it is, we cannot know for sure, right? But we have reasons to believe that it is that increase that we're seeing is driven by unsheltered people moving into shelters. And why we think so? Just by looking at, how much money has been spent by the state in creating, projects like Room Key that house tens of thousands of people. So that's one of the reasons. And the other reason is at the same time, the state had put in place measures in response to the pandemic, such as the eviction moratorium, stimulus checks, and other safety net benefits that likely protected many individuals and families.
Otherwise, they would
have fallen into homelessness.
They would have fallen into homelessness. Listen, we've only got about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you about the number of homeless beds in California. How many are for short-term emergency and how many are for long-term permanent placement?
So we have about 166,000 beds. And of those, we have that there are about 36% of those serve homeless people in shelters, and 64% are dedicated to serve formerly homeless people, which means that are more long-term housing solutions. And those were the, because of the pandemic, last year, the growth was concentrated in emergency shelter beds. There was additional about 7,000 beds. But during the last decade, really the efforts in the state have concentrated in increasing the number of beds in permanent housing.
Yeah, it was a change there because of the pandemic. Well, I want to thank our guest, Marisol Cuellar Mejia with the PPIC. Up next, they say all politics are local, but is that true when it comes to homelessness? Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Newsom dedicated his 2020 State of the State speech to homelessness. In a recent poll by UC Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies and LA Times, however, indicated that registered voters are giving the governor, frankly, low marks on his handling of the homelessness issue, with 66% rating his response as either poor or very poor. What are the political implications? We've got an observer of Capitol politics with us today, Hannah Wiley with the LA Times. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
So listen, the LA Times poll numbers actually have gone up 12% from 2020. That's not a good sign for the governor who has other political aspirations. And he's dealing with a lot of things, right? He's dealing with droughts and wildfires and crime and now homelessness. Now he does have a good budget, but what are the implications of this homelessness issue for Democrats going forward?
Right. Well, voters are very concerned about homelessness. It's one of the top issues for voters in this state. And you're right that the governor has a plate full of problems to deal with in the Golden State. But homelessness is top of mind for voters. We see it everywhere. Voters see it everywhere. It's something for Democrats to be concerned about, certainly. And but at the end of the day, Democrats dominate the state. They dominate the legislature. They dominate every statewide office in this state. So it's not much of a concern for Democrats about losing their supermajority or losing some of these positions. It's just that, exactly like you said, for future posts down the road,
Right.
how is it going to reflect on their record?
And if we had Dan Walters here, the Cal Matters columnist, he would say, don't worry about it, because just as you said, Democrats have supermajorities in both houses. The governor was easily handle the recall and probably will, frankly, the reelection. But long-term prospects, he needs to pay attention to this. One of the things that you've written about is his care court, I think it's called, proposal that would give people with severe mental health and addiction problems a kind of court-ordered treatment. This is different than what he was talking about earlier in terms of conservatorships. How is it different? And tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So back in January, when Newsom unveiled his budget proposal, as he does every year, he talked about wanting to lean into conservatorships this year. And instead, a couple of months later, in early March, he introduced a proposal that he's dubbed the Care Court. And it is not quite a conservatorship, but it is certainly a step in that direction. And it would compel people into treatment who have severe mental health, behavioral issues, substance abuse disorders, etc. It's not a conservatorship, which that concept, that idea, that law is very controversial. So in some ways, this has allowed Newsom to sidestep some of the criticism of enforcing or strengthening conservatorships. But to be sure, it is along those lines.
Yeah, they view it, I guess, more as like a partnership with the person being treated. I guess if it doesn't work, then they move the next level, could be conservative.
Right.
Interesting. There's some bipartisan support for this proposal. You've got people like Bakersfield Mayor Karen Go or Fresno Mayor Jerry Dyer indicating some support. You're seeing some Republican proposals on homelessness actually being picked up by Democrats, who of course have those supermajorities. Are we seeing a breakout of bipartisanship at the Capitol?
Well, I wouldn't hold your breath. I mean, Republicans often, point to Democratic proposals to solve homelessness, and certainly with this Care Court proposal saying, certainly this is what we need to do, but this is also a mess of your making. So it's a little bit too late, a little too late, too little too late. And so there's the idea that the idea of bipartisanship, they might vote for the proposal. They might nod their head in the direction positively, but to be sure, Republicans have also criticized Democrats for not doing enough earlier.
Which is where I was going to go with the next one. I was thinking after I was thinking about that, I was thinking, what, maybe I should come back to reality here and say that, if Republicans are trying to come back into power, the two issues they're probably going to focus on are homelessness and crime. Voters say those are the really big issues. So we're not going to really see this bipartisanship that maybe we hope for. Maybe Republicans are going to use this issue, particularly homelessness, as a way to kind of get back into relevance in California.
Possibly. I mean, they're always trying to be relevant. Their membership in the legislature is dwindling, but this could be the year that they might be able to pick up one or two seats that is in doubt also. But I think they're looking at lower polling around crime and homelessness as the opportunity that they have the solutions for, according to them and their campaign strategists, that this is the year to really get a couple of things done or get a couple more seats in the legislature.
Yeah, from what I understand, looking at the redistricting, they really aren't going to have a hard, that's not much of a chance in the assembly. But in the Senate, they could possibly, at least overcome the supermajority. But I guess we'll see. I want to thank Hannah Wiley with the LA Times for joining us, as well as our other guests. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.